Sup? I'm reliably informed that I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so here I am, pimping my stuff. You can buy most of the shit that I make over at post-mort.com. Hope to see you there. A guy called RPG Elite did a rather interesting video about why more black people don't play RPGs. And rather refreshingly, he didn't blame it all on racism or on white people. Rather, he went into various cultural and circumstantial reasons why there aren't more African Americans playing RPGs. Now, that was very much from an American perspective, and the American black experience is not universal. The American racial minority experience is not universal, so despite being an evil white man, I thought it might be worth giving my perspective on why these things happen in the UK, why there isn't as much uptake. Some of the reasons he gives are more universal. I think black minority ethnic culture, in different ways depending on the culture, can be quite hostile to RPGs, which is something that he touched on. There is a greater amount of religiosity in the Afro-Caribbean community than in the British community as a whole. That's certainly a factor. There is an anti-intellectualism within, well, working class culture as a whole, including white working class culture, and that is, I think, the crux of it when it comes to the UK. There is this idea that these games, this kind of activity involving, reading and mathematics as it does, are somehow quote unquote gay or effeminate, unmasculine, unworthy of attention, or very often on a more sort of racist line, that these things are white people shit. And that is certainly the greatest experience that I've had in trying to get minority ethnic people to come along to games in the past or whatever. The pressure and problem wasn't the community of gamers. That was primarily white anyway, not that surprising in a primarily white country, and primarily middle class as well. Again, not unexpected in a majority white country, and if ethnic communities are more likely to be immigrants just starting out and so on. So that was the primarily driver, was anti-white racism, shall we say. Put it that way. Along with the anti-intellectualism that one tends to see in the working class and underclass, regardless of race. So I think the lack of uptake in the UK and probably in other European countries is much more to do with that culture and that anti-white racism. The pressure primarily comes not from the role-playing community, which as ever is open and welcoming, but from within those black and minority ethnic communities, their fellows within those communities, wondering why they're engaging in this white people shit or spending their weekends with a bunch of white people, that sort of thing. That has seemed to be the primary problem. And in other non-African derived cultures, there's also a sense that games and gaming is a waste of time that could be spent better on other things. These aren't necessarily stereotypes, and they're not true of everybody. There are always exceptions, but that is the other side to this, I think. That games are seen as frivolous, pointless, a waste of time that could be better spent learning music or practicing on something or honing a useful skill. That sort of tiger mom mentality that one sees. Again, this is not by any means everyone, but it's enough to be statistically significant. And I think another issue, more recently, a pernicious one, is this idea that the gaming community is somehow full of racists and bigots and so on. You'll see this bandied about. Nothing could really be further from the truth, but I do think people are perhaps a little more suspicious of people now, having had so many bad encounters and having had been accused of so many things, that there may now be a reluctance and wariness to reach out and to accept in the way that people once did. This idea that typical Western fantasy is somehow inherently racist, or that it is somehow white people's fantasy to have a world in which black people don't exist, rather than Western fantasy tending to derive from Arthurian legend or Robin Hood or medieval romances and so on, at a time when Europe barely contained any non-European people. It's like complaining that Journey to the West only has Chinese people in it. It's just absurd. Or that the Anansi tales only have black people in them. White people, other than a tiny fractional minority, the fantasy is not that black people don't exist. It's just that in the fantastical mythological past that is being imagined or derived from history or existing tales, that was just the way things were. I don't think you can say the same thing about black and minority ethnic fantasies that do seem to, in some cases, willfully annihilate white people from existing or having the historical and global influence that they once had. Coyote and Crow, for example, eliminates white people from America and imagines an alternative. Something like Black Panther imagines a nation that has never had to wrangle with colonialism and so on. It's an area that has eliminated white people. So that does seem to be the fantasy on the other side. And yet you can't point out the flaws in this thinking without arousing more of this opprobrium to be directed at you, no matter how factual you are, no matter how carefully you couch it. And I think there is a difference here. And that then leads to a reluctance, and that then leads to an entrenchment of attitudes. And all based on a misrepresentation. So I think the reasons are complicated, and they're not really to do with representation per se, but rather differences in culture, class, attitude, and increasingly the monstering of what has always been an open and inclusive community well ahead of the curve. Sang.
Splatpunk is a retroclone RPG, so you can make your own Splatpunk games, whether that be cyberpunk, clockpunk, steampunk, biopunk, narcopunk, whatever it might be. You'll find this system adaptable to all your needs. Available at post-mort.com, lulu.com, and drive-through RPG.